Life has a funny way of pulling the rug out from under your feet just when you think you've got everything figured out. That's exactly what happened to Thomas Mitchell, a 35-year-old corporate lawyer who'd thought he was living his dream life in New York City. Every morning, Thomas would wake up to the stunning view of Central Park from his penthouse windows. The sun would paint the sky in beautiful colors, and he'd often stand there with his coffee, just taking it all in. This wasn't just any apartment, it was a $4.2 million corner unit on the 45th floor, the kind of place most people only see in movies. But for Thomas and his wife Claire, it was home. Their love story had started like many others in the city, a chance meeting at a coffee shop near the courthouse. Claire had spilled her latte on Thomas's new suit, and somehow, that awkward moment turned into dinner that evening. Both being lawyers, they spoke the same language, understood each other's crazy work hours, and shared the same dreams of making it big in the city that never sleeps. 8 years of marriage had brought them everything they dreamed of. Thomas had worked his way up to become one of the most respected corporate lawyers in his firm. His colleagues often joked that he could charm any jury and convince a rock to plead guilty. Claire was equally successful, having recently made senior partner at her firm. They were that power couple everyone wanted to be: successful, good-looking, and seemingly perfect. Their penthouse was their pride and joy. Every piece of furniture had been carefully chosen by Claire, from the Italian leather couch to the hand-carved dining table they'd found at an antique shop in Brooklyn. The walls were decorated with art they'd collected from their travels around the world. Each piece told a story, held a memory. Their friends would often comment on how lucky they were, how they had it all figured out. Sunday brunches on their terrace became a tradition, with Claire showing off her cooking skills while Thomas mixed what everyone called the best Bloody Marys in Manhattan. They hosted dinner parties where the city's elite would gather, and their home was featured twice in interior design magazines. But life has a way of teaching us that nothing is ever as perfect as it seems. Looking back, Thomas should have noticed the small changes. The way Claire's smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore during those brunches. How she started spending more time at the office, claiming big cases needed her attention. The mysterious phone calls that would end abruptly when he walked into the room. Maybe he was too busy with his own cases, or maybe he just didn't want to see it. After all, they were the perfect couple living in their perfect penthouse with their perfect lives. Who would want to question that? They had worked so hard to get here, the long hours, the missed holidays, the sacrifices they'd made along the way. This was their reward, their slice of heaven 45 floors above the city. The thing about heaven, though, is that sometimes it's just a pretty package hiding something else entirely. Thomas was about to learn that lesson the hard way. But on that particular morning, as he straightened his tie and grabbed his briefcase, he had no idea that his perfect world was about to come crashing down around him. He kissed Claire goodbye, just like he did every morning. She was wearing her favorite blue suit, the one she said made her feel invincible in the courtroom. "Good luck with the Anderson case," she said, squeezing his hand. "Don't forget we have dinner with the Robertsons tonight." Thomas nodded, already mentally preparing for his day in court. As the elevator doors closed, he caught one last glimpse of their home, the sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the fresh flowers Claire always kept on the coffee table, the life they built together. Little did he know this would be the last normal morning in what he thought was his perfect life. Sometimes the biggest storms come on the clearest days, and Thomas was about to walk right into one that would change everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and the life he'd worked so hard to build. They say hindsight is 20/20ths, and now Thomas could see all the warning signs he'd missed. It started with small things, the kind of changes you brush off as nothing important when you're caught up in the daily grind of life. It began 3 months ago during their regular Sunday brunch. Claire had always been the perfect host, making sure everyone's glasses were full and the conversation never dulled. But that day, she seemed distracted, constantly checking her phone under the table. When their friends asked about her latest cases, she mentioned a new client named James who had a complicated situation. Thomas noticed how her eyes lit up when she talked about this case, but he chalked it up to professional excitement. The business trips started increasing after that. Claire had always traveled for work, but suddenly she was flying to Boston every other week. "It's this big merger," she'd explain, kissing him goodbye. James's company is expanding, and there are so many details to iron out. She'd returned looking refreshed, with a spring in her step that Thomas hadn't seen in years. Their daily routines began to shift too. Claire started going to the gym in the mornings instead of their usual coffee dates. She bought new clothes, nothing flashy, just more modern suits and dresses that made her look younger somehow. Her perfume changed from the vanilla scent she'd worn for years to something more exotic. Just felt like a change, she said when he mentioned it. The late-night phone calls were harder to ignore. Thomas would wake up at 2 a.m. to find her spot in bed empty, only to discover her on their terrace, speaking in hushed tones. Just work stuff, she'd say, quickly ending the call whenever he appeared. He wanted to believe her. After all, they were both lawyers who sometimes dealt with urgent client matters. What really caught his attention was her sudden interest in real estate law. Claire had built her career on corporate mergers, yet now she was constantly reading about property laws and regulations. She even attended a seminar on real estate transactions, claiming it would help with James's case. His company deals with a lot of property acquisitions, she explained, but something in her voice sounded off. Their penthouse, which had always been their shared pride, became a topic she avoided. When Thomas suggested renovating their master bathroom, Claire quickly changed the subject. She stopped hosting their famous dinner parties, saying she was too busy with work. The fresh flowers she used to buy every week disappeared from the coffee table. One evening, Thomas came home early to surprise her with dinner reservations at their favorite restaurant. He found her in their home office, quickly closing laptop windows as he walked in. He caught a glimpse of what looked like property listings before the screen went dark. Just researching something for a client, she said, but her smile seemed forced. Their conversations grew shorter, more superficial. Instead of sharing details about their days over dinner, Claire would steer the talk toward general topics, the weather, the news, anything but personal matters. She stopped asking about his cases, something she'd always taken genuine interest in before. The most telling change was in the little things, the way she stopped leaving notes in his lunch, how their morning goodbye kisses became quick pecks, the absence of those random just thinking of you texts during the day. Their inside jokes faded away, replaced by polite small talk that felt more appropriate for strangers than a married couple. Their friends noticed too. Is everything okay with Claire? His colleague asked one day after a brief lunch where Claire had spent most of the time on her phone. She seems different. Thomas defended her, citing work stress and the pressures of her recent promotion, but the question lingered in his mind. The breaking point should have been when he found a business card in their laundry, James Stevens, real estate investment specialist. But even then, Thomas convinced himself it was innocent, just another client in their busy professional lives. He ignored the handwritten cell phone number on the back, the slight smudge of what looked like a coffee stain suggesting a casual coffee meeting. Looking back, Thomas realized he'd been doing what many people do when their world starts showing cracks, plastering over them with excuses and rationalization. It was easier to believe in their perfect life than to admit something might be wrong. After all, they were the couple others looked up to, the ones who had it all figured out. But life has a way of forcing you to face reality, whether you're ready or not. And for Thomas, that moment was coming sooner than he could have ever imagined. All these changes, these subtle shifts in their relationship, were just the calm before a storm that would tear through their perfectly curated life like a hurricane. That morning started like any other autumn day in New York City. The leaves in Central Park had just started turning golden, and there was that familiar crisp chill in the air that made everyone switch from iced coffee to hot lattes. Thomas was in the middle of preparing for a major court case, surrounded by stacks of papers in his office on the 32nd floor of their law firm's building. His secretary had just brought in his third coffee of the day when his phone buzzed. Claire's name lit up the screen. Normally, she'd text during workdays, knowing they were both usually tied up in meetings or court. A call during business hours was unusual enough to make him answer immediately. Thomas. Her voice had that breathless quality it got when she was stressed. I need your help. It's urgent. The background noise suggested she was in a taxi or on the street. He could hear horns honking and the general buzz of city traffic. What's wrong? He straightened in his chair, already reaching for his suit jacket. There was something in her voice that set off alarm bells, even though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. I'm supposed to be in Boston in 2 hours for that meeting with James, the big client I told you about. But I forgot to email him the final documents, and they're on our home computer." She spoke quickly, words tumbling over each other. "I need you to go home and send them right away. They're in a folder on the desktop labeled Boston Final." Thomas glanced at the papers spread across his desk. He was due in court in 3 hours, and he still needed to review his closing arguments. "Can't you access it remotely? Or maybe email it from your office?" No, she cut in quickly. "The files are too large for our remote system, and I'm already halfway to the airport. Please, Thomas. This could make or break the whole deal. You know how important this client is." He did know, or at least he knew how much she talked about this James person over the past few months. Something about a major real estate portfolio that needed restructuring. The details had always been vague, which he'd attributed to client confidentiality. "I have court this afternoon," he said, but he was already packing up his papers. 8 years of marriage had taught him that sometimes you just had to roll with the punches. "You'll have plenty of time," Claire assured him. "Just go home, send the email, and head straight to court. The doorman knows you're coming. I called ahead. The files are right there on the desktop, you can't miss them." She paused, then added softly, "Thank you, honey. You're saving my life here." That last bit, that gentle, familiar endearment, it almost felt like the old Claire, the one who'd been slowly disappearing over the past few months. Thomas found himself smiling despite the inconvenience. "Okay, I'm heading there now. Text me the email address." "I'll do better than that," she said. I wrote it down and left it on the desk next to the computer. "Everything you need is right there. You're the best, Thomas. I owe you one." The call ended and Thomas quickly gathered his things, explaining the situation to his secretary. She offered to reschedule his afternoon prep meeting, but he waved her off. "I'll be back in plenty of time," he assured her, not knowing just how wrong he was. The taxi ride home felt longer than usual, even though traffic was surprisingly light for that time of day. Thomas found himself thinking about Claire's voice on the phone. There had been something off about it, something he couldn't quite place. Attention, maybe, or a hint of, what? Guilt? Nervousness? The doorman greeted him with a nod as he entered their building, but was there something odd about the way he wouldn't quite meet Thomas's eyes? At the time, it didn't register. His mind was already upstairs in their penthouse, mentally calculating how quickly he could send the email and get back to work. The elevator ride to the 45th floor seemed to take forever. Thomas loosened his tie slightly, suddenly aware of how warm it felt in the confined space. He checked his watch. He still had plenty of time to handle this and make it to court. Everything was fine. Just a small favor for his wife, the kind of thing married couples do for each other all the time. When the elevator doors finally opened to their private foyer, Thomas fished out his keys. The sound of them jingling in his hand seemed unusually loud in the quiet hallway. He had no way of knowing that when he opened that door, he wouldn't just be stepping into his home, he'd be walking into the moment that would change his life forever. The first thing Thomas noticed when he opened the door was the music playing softly from their living room speakers, some jazz piece Claire never would have chosen. The second thing was the unfamiliar leather briefcase sitting on their entryway table, right where he usually dropped his keys. His heart started beating faster, though his mind hadn't quite caught up to why. The penthouse smelled different too, not Claire's usual scented candles, but a masculine cologne that seemed vaguely familiar, though he couldn't place it. "Hello," Thomas called out, his voice echoing slightly in the open space. "Is someone here?" "Oh, you must be Thomas." The voice came from their home office, followed by footsteps. A man emerged, tall, well-dressed in an expensive suit that Thomas's lawyer's eye immediately priced at several $1,000s. He looked to be in his mid-30s, with the kind of confident smile that came from being used to getting what you want. "I'm James Stevens," the man said, extending his hand as if this was the most natural thing in the world, as if he hadn't just been caught in someone else's home. "I've heard so much about you." Thomas felt like he'd stepped into some bizarre alternate reality. James Stevens, the supposedly urgent client in Boston, standing right here in his penthouse. The name clicked into place, along with the memory of that business card he found in the laundry weeks ago. "What are you doing in my home?" Thomas managed to ask. his lawyer's training kicking in, keeping his voice steady despite the chaos erupting in his mind. James's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, Claire didn't tell you. I thought. Well, this is awkward." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that spoke of genuine discomfort. "I'm not just a client, Thomas. I'm actually. He's my boyfriend." Claire's voice came from behind them. Thomas turned to see his wife standing in the doorway, still in that blue suit she'd been wearing that morning. Her face was composed, but her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, a tell she had when she was nervous in court. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Thomas grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself, the leather cool under his fingers. This had to be some kind of bizarre joke or misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. All those small changes, the late-night calls, the mysterious meetings in Boston, everything was suddenly, horribly clear. 6 months, Claire continued, her voice professional, as if she was presenting evidence in court. "James and I have been seeing each other for 6 months. I wanted to tell you differently, but what?" Thomas's voice came out harder than he'd intended. "But you decided to ambush me in my own home instead." James cleared his throat. "Actually, about that, it's not exactly your home anymore." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He looked between them, waiting for someone to say this was all an elaborate prank. But Claire just lifted her chin, that familiar gesture she made when she was about to deliver difficult news to a client. "I sold the Penthouse," she said quietly, to James. "The paperwork was finalized this morning." Thomas sank into the chair he'd been holding. The Italian leather chair they'd picked out together 3 years ago, arguing playfully about whether it was worth the ridiculous price tag. Now it felt like it belonged to a different life entirely. "How?" he managed to ask. "You can't sell property without both owners' signatures." "I never signed anything." A flicker of something, pride, guilt, crossed Claire's face. "Remember those documents you signed last month? The ones I said were for the Thompson merger." The memory hit him like a truck. Claire had caught him as he was rushing out to court, a stack of papers requiring his immediate signature. He trusted her, barely glancing at them as he signed, just like he trusted her about everything else. "You're a lawyer, Thomas," she said, almost gently. "You know how important it is to read everything you sign." The irony might have made him laugh if he wasn't struggling to breathe. The room suddenly felt too small, too warm, despite the floor-to-ceiling windows he'd always loved. Those windows that now, technically, belonged to the man standing in front of him, the man who'd been sleeping with his wife. James took a step forward, his expression attempting sympathy but achieving something closer to condescension. "I know this is a shock, but we can handle this like reasonable adults. My lawyer has prepared a generous lease agreement if you'd like to stay here while you figure things out." Thomas looked at the man offering to let him rent his own home, then at his wife who had orchestrated this entire betrayal. The beautiful penthouse around him, filled with 8 years of memories, suddenly felt like a stage set, artificial and wrong. Without a word, he stood up and walked to the windows. The city spread out below, unchanged, uncaring about the drama unfolding 45 floors above. Somewhere down there was the coffee shop where he'd first met Claire, where a spilled latte had led to all of this. Now here they were, 8 years later, and he was discovering that sometimes the biggest lies come from the people closest to you. The silence in the room felt heavy enough to touch. Thomas turned away from the window to face Claire, who had settled into her familiar pose, arms crossed, chin lifted, the same stance she took when preparing to deliver a closing argument. How many times had he seen her practice that pose in front of their bedroom mirror? "So the urgent meeting in Boston?" Thomas asked, his voice surprisingly calm. "That was just to get me here." Claire nodded, maintaining eye contact like she'd always taught their junior associates to do. "I needed you to see this through, to understand that this isn't just some impulse decision. Everything has been carefully planned." "Carefully planned?" Thomas repeated, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "How long have you been planning this exactly?" "The sale has been in motion for 3 months," she replied, her professional mask firmly in place. "But I've been preparing the groundwork for longer. The property documentation, the transfer papers, making sure everything was legally sound." James moved to stand beside her, and Thomas noticed how natural they looked together. Like they'd practiced this moment, rehearsed their lines and positions. Maybe they had. The market value for properties like this has increased significantly, James added, as if they were discussing a routine business transaction. Claire ensured you'll receive your fair share of the proceeds. The money is already in escrow. Thomas let out a laugh that held no humor. My fair share of my own home. The home we bought together. He turned to Claire. Remember how excited we were when we first saw this place? You said it was perfect because we could see both sunrise and sunset from different windows. A flicker of emotion crossed Claire's face, but she quickly suppressed it. Things change, Thomas. People change. I've changed. Clearly, Thomas said. The Claire I knew wouldn't have forged documents or manipulated her husband. I didn't forge anything, she corrected him sharply. Every document you signed is legally binding. I simply presented them in a way that ensured the desired outcome. You mean you lied, Thomas said flatly. To your husband, to your law partners, to everyone. I did what was necessary, Claire replied. Our marriage has been over for a long time, Thomas. We both know that. We've been living separate lives, going through the motions. This way, at least one of us was steering toward a definitive end. Thomas walked to their dining room table, the one they'd found at that little antique shop in Brooklyn. His fingers traced the familiar scratch near the edge, from the time they tried to move it themselves rather than waiting for movers. And you couldn't have just asked for a divorce? Like a normal person, he asked, looking up at them. All this deception was necessary? Claire's professional demeanor cracked slightly. Would you have agreed to sell the penthouse? Be honest, Thomas. You're as emotionally attached to this place as I used to be. Used to be, Thomas echoed. Until James came along? James shifted uncomfortably. Look, I know this is difficult, but Claire and I... Don't, Thomas cut him off. Just don't. I don't need to hear about your relationship. He turned back to Claire. So what happens now? You've got your sale. You've got your new life planned out. What's the next step in your careful plan? Claire reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope. These are the sale documents, copies of all the paperwork you signed, and details about the escrow account. My lawyer will contact yours tomorrow to begin divorce proceedings. She paused. I've already moved most of my things out. I'll have someone collect the rest next week. How considerate of you, Thomas said quietly. He looked around the penthouse, their dream home that now felt like a beautifully decorated prison. Every corner held a memory: Christmas mornings, lazy Sunday brunches, quiet evenings watching the city lights. All of it had been real for him. Had it ever been real for her? I know you're angry, Claire said, her voice softening for the first time. You have every right to be, but this is better than living a lie, isn't it? Better than pretending we're still the same people who bought this place 8 years ago. Thomas walked to their family photos on the wall, pictures of holidays, parties, moments they'd thought worth preserving. The only one living a lie was you, Claire. I was building a life. You were apparently plotting an escape. He turned to face them both, standing there like executives waiting to close a deal. In a way, he supposed that's exactly what this was to them, just another transaction, another merger, another day at the office. You can keep the photos, Claire offered almost gently. I've already taken the ones I wanted. How long? Thomas asked suddenly. How long have you had the key to our home? He directed this question to James, who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. 3 months, James admitted, since the initial sale agreement. Thomas nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. The mysterious sounds he'd sometimes heard when he came home late from work. The things that seemed slightly out of place. The fresh coffee smell some mornings when Claire had supposedly left early. Well, Thomas said, straightening his tie, lawyer mode engaging like armor. I suppose I should contact my attorney. After all, we wouldn't want anything in this carefully orchestrated plan to be less than legally perfect, would we? He watched Claire flinch slightly at his tone. Good. At least some part of her could still feel something. At least some part of her remembered who they used to be to each other. The next few weeks turned into a blur of legal meetings and sleepless nights. Thomas moved into a hotel suite downtown, unable to stay in the penthouse knowing James had a key. His friend Peter, a fellow lawyer specializing in real estate fraud, took his case immediately after hearing the story. This isn't just about property law anymore, Peter said during their first strategy meeting, spreading documents across his desk. What Claire did crosses several ethical lines. She used her position as your wife and a lawyer to deliberately mislead you. That's not just a breach of trust, it's professional misconduct. Thomas sat in Peter's office, staring at the city skyline. Somewhere out there was his home, now legally belonging to the man his wife had chosen over him. I trusted her, he said quietly. 8 years of marriage, and I signed those papers without even reading them. Peter leaned forward, his expression serious. That's exactly what she counted on. She used your trust against you. But here's the thing, she got sloppy, overconfident, left a trail we can follow. The trail, as it turned out, was more like a highway of questionable decisions. Claire had used her firm's resources to prepare the fraudulent documents, leaving a digital paper trail. She'd conducted private meetings with James in the firm's conference rooms, all logged in the building's security system. Every step of her careful plan had left breadcrumbs they could follow. The thing about being a good lawyer, Peter explained, is knowing not just the law, but how to cover your tracks. Claire was so focused on the big picture, she missed the details. They discovered that Claire had begun laying the groundwork for the sale even before meeting James. Bank records showed she'd been moving money between accounts, setting up offshore holdings, preparing for something long before the affair began. She didn't just wake up one morning and decide to sell the penthouse, Peter said, showing Thomas the timeline they'd constructed. This was calculated, methodical. She was planning her exit strategy for at least a year. The revelation hit Thomas hard. A year. While they were still celebrating anniversaries, planning vacations, living what he thought was their life together, she'd been plotting her escape. Every dinner, every kiss, every shared moment had been a lie. The case grew more complex as they dug deeper. Claire had used her position at her law firm to access confidential property records, altered dates on documents, and even created false business entities to facilitate the sale. Her firm's internal investigation uncovered a web of ethical violations that went beyond their personal drama. She was so careful about the legal documents, Peter said, shaking his head as they reviewed the evidence. But she forgot about the security cameras in the parking garage showing her meetings with James, forgot about the email trails, forgot that people talk. And people did talk. The doorman who'd seen James coming and going. The cleaning staff who'd found personal items long before the sale. Claire's assistant who'd helped book fake business trips to Boston. Each person added another piece to the puzzle. Thomas threw himself into the case, his legal training helping him cope with the personal betrayal. During depositions, he watched Claire's carefully constructed facade begin to crack. Her answers became less certain, her polished demeanor showing signs of strain. The turning point came when they discovered the prenuptial agreement Claire thought would protect her had a morality clause, one she'd violated not just with the affair, but with her professional misconduct. Her own law firm, wanting to distance themselves from the scandal, began their own investigation. She played chess, Peter said during one late-night strategy session, but she forgot to protect her queen. Every move she made to hide the affair and force the sale just dug her deeper into professional misconduct. Thomas remembered Claire's words about everything being carefully planned. Now those plans were unraveling, thread by thread. The same attention to detail that made her a brilliant lawyer was providing the evidence they needed. James, seeing the legal storm approaching, began to distance himself. His lawyer reached out about negotiating a settlement, wanting to protect his real estate empire from the growing scandal. The man who'd offered to let Thomas rent his own home was now scrambling to save his reputation. That's the thing about houses built on sand, Peter said, watching Thomas stare at a photo of the penthouse. When the tide comes in, they don't stand a chance. The legal battle consumed Thomas's days and nights. He lost weight, slept poorly, lived on coffee and determination. But slowly, methodically, they'd built their case. Every document Claire had manipulated, every ethical line she'd crossed, became another brick in the wall of evidence. During one particularly tough day, Thomas found himself back at the coffee shop where he'd first met Claire. Sitting there, watching people rush by with their lives intact, he realized something important. This wasn't just about getting the penthouse back anymore. It was about justice, not just for him, but for every client who trusted their lawyer, every spouse who signed papers believing in their partner's honesty. "We're not just fighting for a property," he told Peter that evening. "We're fighting for what's right." Peter nodded, understanding in his eyes. Sometimes the biggest legal battles aren't about laws at all. They're about trust, honor, and doing the right thing. And those are the battles worth fighting. Justice, as it turned out, moved faster than anyone expected. On a rainy Tuesday morning, 6 months after that fateful day in the penthouse, Thomas sat in the courthouse watching Claire's carefully constructed world crumble. The evidence was overwhelming. Peter had built an airtight case showing not just the property fraud, but a pattern of ethical violations that shocked even seasoned lawyers. Claire sat at the defendant's table, her perfect posture finally breaking as the judge began speaking. "In all my years on the bench," the judge said, his voice filling the quiet courtroom, "I've rarely seen such a calculated abuse of trust, both personal and professional. The court finds the property transfer null and void due to fraudulent misrepresentation." Thomas watched Claire's shoulders slump slightly. The designer suit she wore, probably bought during one of her fake business trips to Boston, couldn't hide her defeat. James wasn't there. He'd settled weeks ago, eager to distance himself from the scandal that was now rocking the legal community. The judge continued, each word another nail in the coffin of Claire's legal career. "Furthermore, this court is referring this matter to the Bar Association for disciplinary review. The evidence shows clear violations of professional ethics that cannot be ignored." Later that afternoon, Thomas stood in the penthouse, his penthouse again, looking out at the city view he'd almost lost. Peter had joined him, both of them holding cups of coffee from the shop where Thomas had first met Claire all those years ago. "You know what's ironic?" Thomas said, breaking the comfortable silence. "She was so worried about me not wanting to sell the place that she created this elaborate scheme. She never just asked me." Peter nodded, understanding in his eyes. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones we need to have the most. The news of Claire's disbarment came 3 weeks later. The same legal skills she'd used to orchestrate the fraudulent sale had provided the evidence for her professional downfall. Her law firm, wanting to protect their reputation, had cooperated fully with the investigation. James's real estate empire took a hit too. Investors became nervous about his involvement in the scandal, and several deals fell through. The last Thomas heard, he'd moved to Chicago to rebuild his business and his reputation, far from the whispers in New York's real estate circles. But the biggest change wasn't in the penthouse's ownership or Claire's career. It was in Thomas himself. The betrayal had forced him to reevaluate everything: his trust, his priorities, his future. He started small, redecorated the penthouse, erasing the traces of Claire's taste that had surrounded him for years. The Italian leather couch was replaced with something more comfortable. The art pieces they'd collected were donated to a local gallery. He kept only one photo from their marriage, a reminder that sometimes the biggest lessons come from our deepest wounds. The healing didn't happen overnight. There were still moments when he'd wake up reaching for someone who wasn't there, or catch himself about to share a funny story with a wife who no longer existed. But each day got a little easier. 6 months after the court's decision, Thomas did something that surprised everyone. He started a support group for people who'd been victims of financial fraud by their spouses. They met monthly in his penthouse, sharing stories and helping each other heal. "The view helps," he told one participant who was struggling to move forward. "It reminds us that no matter how dark things get, the city keeps moving. And so can we." His law practice transformed too. He began specializing in cases involving financial fraud and betrayal, using his personal experience to help others fight back. The skills that had made him a successful corporate lawyer now served a deeper purpose. 1 year to the day after Claire's urgent phone call that had started it all, Thomas hosted a dinner party in the penthouse. Not the formal affairs Claire used to orchestrate, but a casual gathering of the friends who'd supported him through everything. "You know what I learned from all this?" he said as they sat around his new dining table, the city lights twinkling behind them. "Sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted shows you what you really need." Peter raised his glass. "To new beginnings." Thomas smiled, looking around at the faces of true friends, at the home he'd fought to keep, at the life he'd rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. "To truth," he corrected, "and to the strength we find when we fight for it." The city sprawled out below them, unchanged yet somehow different, just like Thomas himself. The penthouse was still 45 floors up, still had the same sunrise and sunset views that had first made them fall in love with it. But now it represented something new, not just a home, but a victory. A reminder that sometimes the hardest battles lead to the most important wins. As his friends laughed and shared stories around him, Thomas realized that Claire had been right about one thing: people do change. But sometimes that change makes you stronger, wiser, and more authentic than you ever thought possible.